Before the truth ever reached the ballroom, there was a single line spoken in the dark of the east corridor, and it went like this. "You buried me alive here, Alaric, and now you dare bring her under my roof to watch you do it a second time. If you have ever stood in a doorway and heard your whole life rearranged in someone else's voice, you already know the ache in that sentence, and you already know why what happens next matters. Before we get there, though, before the carriages arrive and the candles are lit and every secret in this story comes crashing into the light, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which county in England you would have chosen to disappear into, because trust us. Now let's go back to where it truly began, 3 years before that whispered accusation in the dark, to the autumn morning when Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Ashcombe, stood alone at the top of the front steps of a crumbling house and watched her husband's carriage disappear down the drive without once looking back. She had not cried, she had promised herself. Standing there in the cold with her hands folded over her stomach, as though holding herself together by force, that she would not cry in front of the servants. And the Duke had gone abroad on business. He would not fully explain some tangled matter of debts and creditors and a business partner in Lisbon, who apparently required his personal attention for reasons Eleanor had stopped asking about after the third evasive answer. He had kissed her hand at the door, cool and correct as always, and told her the estate would manage itself under Mr. Pratt's stewardship until his return. He had not said when that return might be. He had not said he loved her, though in 5 years of marriage he had rarely said that at all, and Eleanor had long since made a private peace with the absence of it, the way one makes peace with a draught in an old house. You simply learn to keep the fire built higher in that particular room. Ashcombe Hall was, by the time the Duke's carriage had rounded the last bend of elm trees, already a house in quiet decay. The roof over the west wing leaked in 3 places that Eleanor knew of, and likely several more. She did not. The tenant farms had gone 2 seasons without proper drainage work, and the harvests had suffered for it. Mr. Pratt, the steward left in charge, was a soft-spoken man with excellent penmanship and a habit of looking everywhere, but at Eleanor's face when she asked him direct questions about the ledgers, she did not trust him. She could not have said precisely why, not at first, only that his numbers never quite matched his explanations, and that he had a way of speaking to her as though she were a decorative fixture of the house, rather than its mistress. For the first months of her husband's absence, Eleanor did what a duchess was trained from girlhood to do. She waited gracefully, and wrote letters that grew shorter and further apart, and accepted the pitying looks of the county's better families at church, who had always found something faintly comic in a duke who preferred foreign ledgers to his own wife. But waiting, she discovered, was a poor substitute for a roof that did not leak, and Grace bought no grain for tenant families facing a hard winter. So Eleanor did something that no one in her position was supposed to do. She rode out to the tenant farms herself, in a plain wool cloak with mud to her ankles, and she looked at the failing drainage ditches with her own eyes, instead of trusting Mr. Pratt's tidy summaries of them. It was on one such morning, grey and sharp with the first cold of November, that she met the man who would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. He was standing in the flooded lower field of the Hallow Farm, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his boots ruined beyond saving, directing 2 of the tenant's sons in the placement of a trench with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had done such work before and expected to be listened to. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Julian Gray, a land agent recently arrived in the district, available for hire to any household sensible enough to want its fields properly drained before the spring thaw drowned them. He did not bow to her title. He did not fumble or flatter. He looked at her the way one looks at a colleague rather than a portrait, and asked her opinion on the gradient of the trench as though she might actually have one. She did as it happened, and she gave it, and he listened and adjusted his plan and thanked her without a trace of condescension. It was such a small exchange, it should not have mattered at all. But Eleanor rode back to the hall that afternoon with something loosening in her chest that she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit, and she told herself firmly that it was only the satisfaction of being useful and nothing more. Mr. Pratt did not care for Julian Gray from the first. He said so plainly, in his careful, sideways manner, remarking that it was unbecoming for a duchess to be seen conferring with hired men in muddy fields, and that such matters were properly left to the steward's judgment. Eleanor listened to this with the particular stillness she had learned in 5 years of marriage to a man who preferred not to be questioned. And then she hired Julian Gray anyway over Mr. Sem Pratt's objections to oversee the repair of every drainage system on the estate. It was the first decision of any consequence she had made, entirely on her own authority, and, signing her name to the contract, felt like setting down a weight she had not known she was carrying. Over the following weeks that single contract became a dozen. Julian Gray, it turned out, was not merely competent with a shovel and a gradient chart. He understood crop rotation and mill efficiency, and the delicate arithmetic of tenant leases in a way that made Mr. Pratt's ledgers look, by comparison, like the work of a child playing at accounts. Eleanor began to attend the estate meetings she had previously only observed, asking questions, proposing changes, learning, with a hunger she had not expected in herself, the actual mechanics of a household she had spent 5 years. Julian answered every question fully, treated every proposal seriously, and never once suggested that a woman's proper place was elsewhere. There was in all of this a friendship building itself brick by careful brick, though neither of them named it that. They wrote the boundaries of the estate together, discussing soil and rents. They sat late over ledgers by lamplight, the old housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, hovering nearby with tea and a watchful, approving eye for Mrs. Finch had served Eleanor since girlhood and had opinions about the Duke that she was too loyal to voice aloud and too honest to fully hide from her face. Julian Gray laughed rarely, but when he did, it transformed him entirely, softening a face that otherwise held itself with a careful, guarded reserve that Eleanor recognized because she wore a version of it herself. He never spoke of his own family, his own past, beyond the barest facts, educated abroad, no living parents, no particular attachment to any one place. Eleanor did not press him on it. She understood, better than most, the value of a door kept closed on a room one did not wish to revisit. By the second winter of the Duke's absence, Ashcombe Hall had begun, quietly and unmistakably, to heal. The drainage held through the spring floods that ruined half the neighbouring estates. The tenant farms, freed from Mr. Pratt's mismanagement, and guided instead by Julian's steady hand, produced their best harvest in a decade. Eleanor herself had changed almost as visibly as the land. She rode straighter, spoke more plainly, and had stopped, entirely, waiting for her husband's letters, which had in any case stopped arriving at all sometime around the 18-month mark, replaced only by terse quarterly notes from his London solicitor confirming that funds continued to be drawn against the estate for expenses abroad. It was Mrs. Finch who said one evening, as she helped Eleanor out of her riding habit, what neither of them had dared say plainly before. "You have built something here, Your Grace, that no one gave to you." Eleanor had looked at her own reflection in the glass, sun-browned, clear-eyed, entirely unlike the pale, waiting bride who had stood at the top of the steps 3 years before, and had understood with a small private ache that Mrs. Finch was right, and that she was no longer entirely certain she wanted the man who had left her to come home and claim any part of it. She did not yet know how soon she would be tested on exactly that question. The first sign that something in the arrangement of the world was about to shift came not from London, but from Mr. Paul Pratt, who arrived at Eleanor's study one grey March morning with an expression of barely suppressed satisfaction that she had learned, over 3 years, to distrust instinctively. He informed her with a small bow that felt more like a threat than a courtesy that he had received word, through channels he did not specify, that His Grace the Duke was at long last making arrangements to return to England. Eleanor set down her pen very carefully, aware of the sudden thickness in her own throat, and asked when. "Within the fortnight, Your Grace, Mr. Grayter," Pratt said, and then added, with a delicacy that did nothing to disguise the cruelty underneath it, "I understand His Grace does not travel alone." The rest of that day passed for Eleanor in a strange, muffled distance, as though she were observing her own life through glass. She told herself it changed nothing, that she had managed the estate alone for 3 years, and could certainly manage her husband's return, alongside whatever companion he had acquired abroad. But that night alone, in the vast cold bed that had been hers alone for so long, she had nearly forgotten it was meant to hold two. She allowed herself for the first time in a long while to weep, not for the loss of a marriage that had never truly been warm, but for the quiet, private thing she had built with Julian Gray. With sudden clarity, she was about to be forced to defend or lose, or both. Julian, when she told him the next morning in the cold light of the estate office, said very little at first. He only looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite read, something between grief and resolve, and then he said, "Then we had better make certain, Duchess, that when he arrives he finds nothing here he has any right to dismantle." It was the closest either of them had come in 2 years to admitting what the estate's revival had truly cost and meant to each of them, and Eleanor carried the warmth of it with her like a coal held close against a coming winter. Word of the Duke's return spread through the county with the particular speed reserved for scandal, and by the time his travelling coach actually turned up the long drive of Ashcombe Hall on a wet afternoon in early April, half the parish had already heard that His Grace was bringing home a foreign lady of uncertain rank and unmistakable beauty, and that the Duchess, poor, patient, abandoned Duchess Eleanor, was very much not expecting to share her house with either of them. The coach that finally arrived was mud-splattered from the long journey up from the coast, and when the door opened, the Duke stepped down first, exactly as Eleanor remembered him, tall, elegantly composed, his features handsome in the cold, unbothered way of a man who had never once had to fight for anything in his life. 3 years abroad had aged him only slightly. A touch of grey at the temples, Alina set to his jaw, but his eyes, when they found Eleanor's on the front steps, held the same distant assessing quality they always had, as though he were checking an inventory. Behind him, a second figure emerged from the coach, and the small gathered crowd of servants and curious tenants let out an audible collective breath. She was, without question, beautiful, dark-haired, elegantly dressed in a travelling gown of deep green silk that had clearly never seen an English winter, with a poise that suggested she had spent considerable time cultivating exactly the effect she now produced. The Duke turned to her with a courtesy he had not shown Eleanor in years, offering his hand to help her down, and said, in a voice pitched to carry across the drive to where his wife stood, "Allow me to present Lady Seraphina Rourke. She has been of considerable comfort to me these past years abroad." Eleanor felt the words land like small, precise blows, delivered in front of her own household staff, her own tenants, on the steps of the house she had spent 3 years rebuilding with her own hands and Julian Gray's steady counsel. She did not flinch. She had learned, in 5 years of marriage and 3 years of solitude, exactly how not to flinch. She inclined her head with perfect icy correctness and said, "Welcome to Ashcombe, Lady Seraphina." I trust the journey was not too tiring, and if her voice shook at all, only Mrs. Finch, standing close behind her with a face like carved granite, was near enough to hear it. That night, at what was meant to be a quiet homecoming dinner, but felt instead like the opening move of a war neither side had yet declared outright, the Duke informed Eleanor over the soup calls that Lady Seraphina would be staying at Ashcombe Hall indefinitely, in the West Guest Wing. As a personal friend of the family, requiring English hospitality while she settled certain business affairs of her own. He said this with the flat, unapologetic ease of a man accustomed to having his household arrangements accepted without comment, and Eleanor understood, watching him say it, that he expected exactly that. Silence, grace, the same patient absorption of humiliation she had offered him for 5 years before he left. She gave him instead a different answer. "The West Wing," she said, setting down her spoon with deliberate care, "has been under repair since the roof failed 2 winters ago. I am afraid I cannot in good conscience house a guest there until the plaster work is finished. Perhaps Lady Seraphina would prefer lodgings in the village until then." It was not quite a refusal. It was, however, unmistakably not the compliance the Duke had expected, and something flickered across his face. Surprise first, and then something colder and more calculating, before he recovered his composure and remarked, in a voice gone suddenly soft with menace, that he had not realized his wife had taken to managing the household's guest arrangements without consulting him. "Someone had to manage something, Your Grace," Eleanor said, "while you were away." The silence that followed was long enough for the footman to refill the water glasses twice before anyone spoke again. It did not take Mr. Pratt long to make his allegiance in the new arrangement entirely clear. Within a week of the Duke's return, he had installed himself at the man's right hand with the eager efficiency of a man who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this reversal of fortune, and Eleanor began to notice, with a rising unease, that certain documents she had signed over the past 3 years, leases, repair contracts, the very deed transferring management authority of the tenant farms to her direct oversight, had begun to go quietly missing from the estate office, only to reappear days later, altered in small but significant ways, or accompanied by new documents bearing signatures. Julian noticed it too, sooner than she did, and it was he who first said aloud the word that would come to define the entire dark heart of what followed: fraud. He came to her in the estate office late one evening, a stack of papers in his hand, and a grim, careful expression on his face that told her, before he said a word, that whatever he had found was worse than either of them had feared. "Duchess," he said quietly, closing the door behind him, though there was no one else in the house awake to overhear, "I need you to look at these very carefully, and I need you to tell me if you signed them." The documents were leases, 3 of them, for tenant farms Eleanor knew intimately, farms whose families she had personally reassured through 2 hard winters, and each bore her signature at the bottom, elegant and unmistakable, transferring the leases from the tenants who had worked them for generations, according to the letterhead, in London under the name Ashwell Holdings. Eleanor stared at her own signature for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in her stomach, because she had never in her life signed those pages, and yet the hand that had made those letters was impossibly indistinguishable from her own. "I did not sign these," she said at last, and heard the tremor in her own voice. "I did not think you had," Julian said, but someone has taken considerable trouble to make it appear that you did." He laid a fourth document on the table between them, this one bearing Mr. Pratt's signature as witness, and beside it a fifth, older and more official in its stamps and seals, that made Eleanor's breath stop entirely in her chest. It was a record filed with the county registrar 6 months prior, noting an irregularity in the original marriage settlement between herself and the Duke, a clerical dispute over the exact wording of the dower rights. Filed, the document claimed at the request of His Grace's London solicitor and left curiously unresolved pending further review. "What does it mean?" Eleanor asked slowly, though some cold, prescient part of her had already begun to guess. Julian's face, when he answered, was graver than she had ever seen it. "I believe," he said, "that someone intends to argue, when the moment is most useful to them, that your marriage settlement was never properly executed at all, and that if such an argument succeeded, Duchess, you would have no legal claim whatsoever to this house or this land or anything upon it. I believe Mr. Pratt has spent 3 years quietly building the instruments of your removal, and I believe the Duke has come home now, with Lady Seraphina beside him, because the instrument is finally ready to be used." Eleanor sat very still in the lamplight. The forged leases spread before her like a hand of cards dealt against her without her knowledge, and felt the full shape of the danger settle over her at last. Not merely humiliation, not merely a husband's cold indifference dressed up now in a mistress's green silk, patient dismantling of everything she had built, engineered by men who had never once believed she had the right to build it in the first place. "Then we had better," she said, echoing his own words back to him with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, "make certain, find nothing here they can take." It was Julian who insisted, in the days that followed, that they move with caution rather than confrontation, and it was through that caution that Eleanor first began to learn who Julian Gray truly was. He had contacts, it emerged, in London far beyond what a simple land agent ought to possess, a solicitor of considerable reputation who owed him a debt Julian would not fully explain, a clerk at the very registrar's office where the dower dispute had been filed. When Eleanor asked, with growing bewilderment, how a land agent had come to know such men, Julian was silent for a long moment, turning his glass of brandy slowly in the lamplight, before he finally said, "Because I was not always a land agent, Duchess. I was born to rather more than a shovel and a gradient chart, and rather less than I would have wished. If I tell you the whole of it now, I am afraid it will complicate matters. We cannot afford to complicate. Will you trust me a little longer, on the strength of what we have already built, without the rest of the story?" She looked at him across the small, warm circle of lamplight. This man who had drained her fields and taught her her own ledgers, and never once in 2 years treated her as anything less than an equal, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did trust him entirely, and that the trust cost her nothing at all to give. "I will," she said, and if her heart beat a little faster in the giving of it than the moment strictly required, she kept that, too, to herself. The Duke's mistress, meanwhile, had not spent her weeks at Ashcombe idle. Lady Seraphina Rourke possessed a talent, Eleanor came to realize, for a particular kind of cruelty disguised entirely as charm. She would praise Eleanor's management of the householding company in a tone that somehow made the praise sound like pity, and remark, with wide, innocent eyes, on how very tired the Duchess must be after so many years managing things quite alone, as though loneliness were a personal failing rather than an abandonment inflicted upon her. At the small dinner the Duke hosted for the neighbouring families to formally reintroduce himself to county society, Serafina wore a necklace Eleanor recognised with a jolt as having belonged to the Duke's own late mother, and made certain across the length of the table that Eleanor saw her wearing it. "Your husband tells me," Serafina said to her that evening, in the careful, honeyed voice she used exclusively when others were listening, "that you have taken quite an interest in farming these past years. How resourceful. I confess I could never manage such things myself. I have always relied on a man to see to the difficult matters." The table laughed softly, appreciatively at what was framed as self-deprecation, and was, in fact, a precisely aimed blade. And Eleanor smiled with the same icy correctness she had offered on the front steps, and said nothing at all because she had learned, from 3 years of managing men like Mr. Pratt, that the most dangerous weapon in such rooms was never the insult, but the silence that followed it, unanswered, hanging in the air until everyone present understood exactly who had chosen not to dignify it. Later, in the privacy of her own chamber, Mrs. Finch helping her from her gown with hands gentler than her expression, Eleanor allowed herself briefly to feel the full weight of the evening. "She wears his mother's jewels as though they were given to her," Eleanor said quietly, "and he lets her. He was always a man who let things happen to him, Your Grace, rather than one who made them happen, Mrs." Finch said, with the particular bluntness she reserved for moments when no one else could hear, "It is a poor quality in a duke, and a worse one in a husband. You have spent 3 years learning to be neither of those things yourself. I should not let one homecoming undo it." Eleanor held on to those words in the weeks that followed, because the homecoming, it soon became clear, had not finished revealing its dangers. Mr. Pratt began appearing at the tenant farms uninvited, asking questions of frightened families about lease terms and rent arrears in a tone that promised consequences, and 2 of the families Eleanor had personally reassured through the hardest winter came to her, hats in hand, faces drawn with worry, to ask whether it was true, whether the Duke's man had told them right, that their leases might soon belong to a company in London, and their rents might soon triple to match it. Eleanor promised them, with a conviction she prayed was not misplaced, that nothing would happen to their homes while she had breath left to prevent it, and rode back to the hall that evening with her jaw set and her resolve, if anything, sharpened rather than shaken. It was Julian who brought the next piece of the puzzle, arriving at the estate office 3 days later, with an expression that mixed grim satisfaction with real alarm. His London solicitor had confirmed, through careful inquiry, that Ashwell Holdings, the company named on the forged leases, was not, as it had first appeared, an independent business interest of Mr. Pratt's own devising. It had been registered 18 months prior, with 2 directors named on its founding papers, Mr. Josiah Pratt, and, in a smaller, more carefully obscured entry buried in the secondary filings, one Lady Serafina Rourke. "She is not merely his mistress," Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning with a cold, clarifying rush. "She is his partner. In this, in all of it." "I believe," Julian said, "that Lady Serafina and Mr. Pratt have been in correspondence considerably longer than 3 years, and that the Duke's absence abroad was rather more convenient for their purposes than either you or he ever understood. I believe the debts that kept him abroad these 3 years were not entirely his own making. I believe he was in his own way as managed by Mr. Pratt's ledgers as you nearly were." It was, Eleanor thought, a strange and unwelcome kind of mercy to learn that her husband's abandonment had perhaps been as much engineered as chosen, and she was not yet certain whether it made her feel more or less angry on his behalf or her own. The escalation, when it came, arrived without warning on a bright, unseasonably warm afternoon in late May, in the form of Mr. Pratt himself, standing in the doorway of the estate office, with a folded document in his hand and an expression of undisguised triumph that told Eleanor, before he spoke a single word, that the long, patient scheme had finally reached the moment it had been built for. "His Grace has instructed me, Mr. Pratt said, to inform you, Your Grace, that in light of certain irregularities discovered in the original marriage settlement, irregularities his solicitors have only now, regrettably, brought fully to light, your continued residence at Ashcombe Hall in the capacity of Duchess cannot be presumed to be legally secure. His Grace is, of course, prepared to be generous in the matter of your eventual settlement, provided you do not contest the finding, and provided you vacate the west and central wings within the fortnight to allow for necessary preparations." He said all of this in the flat, careful tone of a man reading aloud from a script he had rehearsed many times, and when he finished, he laid the folded document on the desk before her with the small, satisfied smile of a man delivering the final move of a long game. Eleanor did not touch the document immediately. She sat, very still, hands folded in her lap, exactly as she had stood on the front steps 3 years before, and felt, distantly, the strange vertigo of watching her entire life be dismantled by a piece of paper carried in by a man who could not meet her eyes even now at the moment of his triumph. "And where," she said at last, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect it to be, "am I to go, Mr. Pratt, once I have vacated my own house?" "That, Your Grace," Mr. Pratt said, "is not, I am afraid, my concern." And he left the document on the desk and departed, and Eleanor sat alone in the fading afternoon light for a long time before she allowed herself, finally, the luxury of putting her head in her hands. It was Julian who found her there an hour later, and it was Julian who, having read the document through twice, with a growing controlled fury she had never before seen him display, said the words that would carry her through the darkest stretch of what remained of the story. "This document is worthless, Duchess. It is a threat dressed up as a legal finding, filed by men who are counting on you being too frightened or too alone to challenge it. You are neither of those things anymore. I have watched you become neither of those things for 2 years in this very room. We are not going to let a forged signature and a coward's letter take from you what you built with your own 2 hands while he was gone. But I will need your full trust now, and I will need to tell you, at last, the entire truth of who I am, because the men we are about to fight will not be moved by a land agent's word alone, and they will need to reckon, instead. The revelation, when it came, arrived not as Eleanor had imagined such revelations arriving, not with trumpets or triumph, but quietly, over cold tea in the estate office, in the low, careful voice of a man laying down a burden he had carried alone. Julian Gray, it emerged, was in fact Julian Ashworth Thorne, 3rd Earl of Faircross, who had disappeared from society entirely 6 years prior, following the scandal of his father's ruinous debts and the collapse of the family's fortune, under circumstances that had left half of London believing the old Earl had taken his own life rather than face his creditors, and the other half believing, with rather less charity, that the entire family had been complicit in the fraud that caused the collapse. Julian, the sole heir, had spent the years since rebuilding both his fortune and his name from the ground up under an assumed identity, learning the actual practical mechanics of land and agriculture and finance that his own father had never troubled to learn. He would do so as a man who understood what a title was actually meant to protect. "I did not tell you," he said, "because I did not want you to look at me the way the whole of London looked at my father's name, with pity, or suspicion, or both. I wanted for once in my life to be valued for what I could actually do, rather than what I had been born to. And then, he added more quietly, I found I did not want to stop being that man, even after I came to care for you rather more than a land agent has any business caring for his employer's wife. Eleanor absorbed this in silence for a long moment, turning the enormity of it over in her mind, not merely the revelation of his rank, though that alone would have staggered most women of her acquaintance, but the plainer, more devastating truth folded inside his final sentence. Spoken so carefully, it was almost possible to pretend it had not been spoken at all. "You care for me," she said finally. Not quite a question. "I have cared for you," Julian said, "since a cold morning in a flooded field, when you gave me your honest opinion on a drainage gradient instead of simply agreeing with whatever I said because of who I was supposed to be. I have never told you because you had a husband and a house to save, and I did not think it was my place to complicate either. I am telling you now only because I think you deserve, before we walk into whatever fight is coming, to know exactly who is standing beside you and why." It was not, Eleanor thought later, the declaration a woman dreamed of receiving. Not roses, not poetry, not a knee bent on a ballroom floor. But it was in its plain, unadorned honesty, the truest thing anyone had said to her in the whole of her adult life, and she found, sitting there in the fading afternoon light, with the forged document still lying unread upon the desk between them, that she wanted very much to weep, did not, and instead reached across the table and took his hand and held it, and said only, "Then let us go and fight it, Julian. Together, this time." And, honestly, the gathering of evidence that followed consumed the better part of 3 weeks, and Eleanor threw herself into it with the same fierce, methodical energy she had once brought to draining the flooded fields of Hallow Farm. Julian's London solicitor, a sharp, unsentimental man named Mr. Parr, Aldous Reeve, arrived at Ashcombe within days, and together, the three of them, Duchess, disguised Earl, and solicitor, began the patient work of assembling a case strong enough to withstand whatever the Duke and his conspirators might bring against it. They took depositions from the county registrar's clerk, who confirmed, under careful private questioning, that the dower dispute filing had been lodged not by any solicitor acting for the Duke, but by Mr. Clamper, Pratt personally, using a forged letter of authorization. They took statements from the 2 tenant families who had been threatened with the transfer of their leases, each account corroborating the timeline of Mr. Pratt's increasingly aggressive visits, Mrs. Finch questioned gently by Mr. Day, Reeve about the household's daily comings and goings produced from a locked drawer she had quietly maintained, for reasons of her own, for over a year, a small stack of correspondence she had discreetly retained after finding it improperly discarded in the estate office. Great. Letters between Mr. Sears, Pratt, and Lady Seraphina, dated well before the Duke's return, discussing in coldly practical terms the timing of the arrangement and the necessity of the Duke remaining usefully occupied abroad until matters at Ashcombe. "I did not know what it meant, Your Grace, when I first found them," Mrs. Finch admitted, her weathered face uncharacteristically uncertain. "Only that it did not smell right, and I have learned, in 40 years in this house, to trust what does not smell right." Eleanor took the old housekeeper's hands in both of hers, and thanked her with a warmth that left them both briefly unable to speak at all. The banker who held the estate's principal accounts, a cautious, correct man named Mr. Paul. Osgood, who had served the family for 2 generations, was harder to persuade, bound as he felt by discretion to his clients regardless of their conduct. But Julian's quiet revelation of his true rank combined with Mr. Tender, Reeve's careful legal argument that continued silence in the face of documented fraud, exposed the bank itself to liability, eventually produced from Mr. Coppolity. Osgood's own ledgers, a damning confirmation. Substantial sums drawn against the estate over the previous 18 months, authorized by Mr. Brayne. Pratt, in the Duke's continued absence, transferred not to any legitimate estate expense, but directly into accounts held by Ashwell Holdings, the very company whose forged leases had first alerted Julian to the scheme. By the time the evidence was fully assembled, laid out across the long table of the estate office in neat, damning stacks, Eleanor understood that what she and Julian had built was not merely a defense against a false claim upon her marriage. Been quietly bleeding Ashcombe Hall for the better part of 2 years, engineered by a steward and a mistress who had counted at every turn on no one troubling to look closely enough to notice the Duke, when confronted privately by Mr. Tinns. Reeve with the barest outline of what had been found, a courtesy Julian had insisted upon over Eleanor's initial objection, on the grounds that a public reckoning conducted with dignity would serve their purposes better than one conducted purely for spectacle, received the news with a stunned, brittle silence that suggested, for the first time since his return, genuine and unrehearsed shock. Whatever else could be said of Alaric Vane, Duke of Ashcombe, it became clear in that private meeting that he had not, in fact, known the full extent of what his steward and his mistress had built in his absence, only that he had been content, in his own cold and incurious way, to let matters at home take care of themselves, while he attended to a life abroad that, had it now emerged, been rather more precarious and rather more dependent on Ashcombe's continued financial bleeding than he had ever cared to examine. But knowledge of his own deceit did not in the end soften him toward accountability. Faced with the choice between a quiet, private settlement in Eleanor's favor and a public admission of how thoroughly he had been played by the two people he had trusted most, the Duke chose, with the same cold self-preservation that had characterized the whole of his marriage, to insist the documents were forgeries produced by his wife and her land agent in a scheme to seize the estate for themselves, and to demand that the matter be settled not quietly, but publicly before the assembled magistrates and gentry of the county at the summer assizes, confident, even now, that his rank alone would carry the day against a wife the county had always found faintly ridiculous, and a land agent whose true name no one yet knew. It was, Eleanor thought, watching him make this final, fatal miscalculation from across the drawing-room, the last mistake a man like Alaric Vane was ever likely to make out of pure, unexamined pride. And she found, to her own surprise, even as she understood, exactly how thoroughly that pride was about to be dismantled before the entire county. The county assizes convened on a bright morning in June in the old assembly hall at the centre of the market town, packed to its rafters with every family of consequence for 30 miles, drawn by a scandal too delicious to resist. The Duke's mistress installed openly at Ashcombe, the Duchess's marriage under legal challenge. Ta! A steward's fraud whispered about in every drawing-room since the previous week. Eleanor arrived, dressed with deliberate, unshowy dignity. Mrs. Bray Finch beside her, and took her seat with her spine straight and her hands folded exactly as they had been on the front steps 3 years before, though everything else about her, everyone in that room could plainly see, had changed entirely in the interval. The Duke arrived with Lady Seraphina on his arm, and Mr. Pratt a careful pace behind, and made, from the opening moment, a considerable show of magnanimous patience, as though the entire proceeding were a tiresome formality. He consented to endure, only out of a generous unwillingness to see his estranged wife. His solicitor, a London man of considerable polish, opened the proceedings by presenting the dower rights dispute as a genuine and regrettable legal irregularity discovered only recently, entirely without malice, and suggested with practiced sympathy that the Duchess's subsequent business dealings during her husband's absence, dealings conducted, he noted delicately, with the assistance of a hired land agent of unknown background, might themselves bear closer scrutiny before the court concerned itself with the validity of the leases she had signed. It was, Eleanor recognized, precisely the argument they had anticipated, and precisely the argument Mr. Reeve now proceeded, with quiet, devastating patience, to dismantle piece by piece before the entire assembled county. He produced the registrar's clerk, who testified under careful questioning and to a rising murmur of scandalized whispers that the dower dispute filing bore a forged letter of authorization, and that the true instigator of the filing had been not the Duke's solicitor at all. Josiah Pratt acting, the clerk stated plainly, on instructions he now understood to have come from Lady Seraphina Rourke. The murmur that swept the assembly hall at that name being spoken aloud in that context in front of the Duke himself was the first true crack in the composure Alaric Vane had maintained since entering the room. Eleanor watched it happen across the width of the hall, watched him turn, slowly, to look at Seraphina beside him, and watched Seraphina's carefully arranged composure falter just slightly, just long enough for half the room to see it. Mr. Reeve did not pause to let the moment settle. He produced, next, the registered founding documents of Ashwell Holdings, read aloud in full the names of its 2 directors, and laid before the presiding magistrate the banker Osgood's ledgers showing the systematic transfer of estate funds into that company's accounts over 18 months of the Duke's absence, funds that had, Mr. Jattiang, Reeve noted, financed a considerable portion of Lady Seraphina's own establishment during that same period, a detail that produced, from the gathered gentry, an audible collective gasp that Eleanor suspected would be repeated in every drawing-room in the county for months to come. It was Mrs. Finch's letters, read into the record last, that delivered the final and most complete devastation. Mr. Sen, Reeve read them slowly in his flat, unemotional solicitor's voice, letting the correspondence's own coldly practical language do the work no dramatic flourish could have improved upon. The careful discussion of timing, the explicit reference to keeping the Duke usefully occupied abroad, the frank acknowledgment in Lady Seraphina's own hand that the Duchess's continued industry at the estate, while regrettable, provides useful cover for the present, until the moment came to move against her. When Mr. Skent, Reeve finished reading, the assembly hall fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear quite clearly the small, sharp intake of breath from Lady Seraphina beside the Duke, and the low, strangled sound that emerged from the Duke himself as the full architecture of his own deception, and his own utter uselessness within it, became at last unmistakably plain to every family of consequence for 30 miles. It was at this point, with the room still reeling, that Alaric Vane turned to his wife across the width of the hall and said, in a voice gone suddenly raw, with something that might have been fury, or might in some small buried part of him have been shame, the words that would become the whispered line repeated in every account of the assizes for years afterward. "You knew all this time. You have been rebuilding this estate right under my nose, and you never once told me what you suspected." And Eleanor, rising from her seat with a calm that came from 3 years of learning exactly how to stand her ground in rooms that expected her to fold, answered him in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "I did not tell you, Your Grace, because you were not here to be told. You were abroad, comfortably occupied, while your mistress and your steward bled this house dry, and I rebuilt it with my own hands, rather than wait for a husband who had already made plain, long before he ever boarded that ship, precisely how little he valued what waiting for him would cost me." The magistrate, when he finally spoke, required very little time to reach his determination. The dower rights dispute, he ruled, was fraudulent from its inception and was struck entirely from the record, restoring Eleanor's marriage settlement to its full and original standing. The leases signed under her forged authority were declared void, the tenant lands restored immediately to their rightful holders under terms Eleanor herself had negotiated. Pratt and Lady Seraphina Rourke were referred, on the magistrate's own instruction, to the King's Bench for prosecution on charges of fraud and forgery, and it was noted for the record, with the particular dry severity magistrates reserve for men who have embarrassed themselves thoroughly in public, that the Duke's own negligence in the management of his estate and his household, whatever its cause, had created the very conditions in which such a fraud could flourish unchecked for the better part of 2 years. It was into this ringing, echoing silence that Julian Thorne rose from his seat at the back of the hall, where he had sat throughout the entire proceeding, in the plain, unremarkable coat of a land agent, watching without a word, and walked forward to stand beside Eleanor, and said, "The second great revelation of that extraordinary morning. I believe, before this court concludes its business, there is one further matter of identity that deserves clarifying, for the sake of the record and for the sake of the Duchess, whose trust I would not wish to see mistaken by anyone present for something lesser than it was. I am not, in truth, a hired land agent. I am Julian Ashworth Thorne, Earl of Faircross, and I have spent 6 years rebuilding, under a plainer name, the fortune and the honour my own father's failures took from my family. I came to Ashcombe as a stranger and stayed, in the end, because I found in its Duchess a partner in every sense the word deserves, one I intend, if she will permit it, to make my wife the moment the law allows it." The gasp that followed this second revelation was, if anything, louder than the first, and it was followed, within the space of a breath, by something the Assembly Hall had not produced at any point during the long damning proceedings, a ripple of spontaneous delighted applause from the assembled gentry, several of whom, exhausted amusement, had spent the better part of 3 years pitying her openly at church, and now seemed entirely prepared to claim, retroactively, that they had always suspected there was more to their neighbour's Duchess than the county had given her credit for. The months that followed the assizes passed, for Eleanor, with a settled, quiet joy she had not believed herself capable of feeling after so long a season of loneliness and struggle. The Duke, stripped of both his mistress and his steward, and thoroughly humiliated before the whole of county society, withdrew from Ashcombe entirely, ceding, under the terms of a settlement Mr. Marley Reeve negotiated with unsentimental precision, full and permanent control of the estate to Eleanor in her own right, an arrangement so unusual for a woman of her rank that it required, in the end, a special Act of Parliament to fully secure, pushed through with the quiet, considerable influence of the newly reinstated Earl of Faircross, who found D.N. his return to society, that his name commanded rather more respect than he had expected, and used every ounce of it in his wife's service. Lady Seraphina Rourke and Mr. Pratt, Josiah Pratt, were tried before the King's Bench that autumn, and convicted, receiving sentences that satisfied the county's considerable appetite for justice, without ever fully satisfying Eleanor's own quieter, more private sense that no punishment could entirely repay 2 years of stolen peace. The 2 tenant families whose leases had been forged were the first she visited, personally, to confirm their lands secure forever, and it was Old Hallow himself, the eldest tenant on the estate, who told her, with tears standing openly in his eyes, that no lord or lady in his 60 years on that land had ever ridden out in the mud to look at a drainage ditch with her own eyes before deciding it, and that Ashcombe had never in his memory been better served than by the Duchess who did. Eleanor and Julian were married the following spring, in the small stone church at the edge of the Ashcombe estate, rather than any grand cathedral in London, with Mrs. T. Finch weeping openly in the front pew, and Old Hallow's grandchildren scattering flowers along the churchyard path, and the ceremony was, by unanimous and delighted agreement of everyone present, the least fashionable and most genuinely joyful wedding the county had witnessed in a generation. Julian restored Faircross, his own ancestral estate, to health with the same patient, practical care he had once brought to Ashcombe's flooded fields, and the two estates joined by marriage and managed side by side by a Duchess and an Earl who had each learned the hard way exactly what it cost to rebuild something with their own two hands, prospered together for the whole of their long life, in a way that neither had managed alone. Years later, when their eldest daughter asked her mother, as children eventually always do, how she had come to marry a man who had first arrived at Ashcombe with mud on his boots and no title to his name at all, Eleanor would tell her, settled certainty of a woman who had learned the truth of it the hard way, and never once doubted it since, that a man's worth was never carried in the title, stitched into his coat, nor a woman's worth in the patience she was told to show while waiting for someone else to build her life for her, morning after muddy morning, to actually do the difficult thing in front of you, and that everything else, every title, and every reckoning and every quiet justice finally done before a packed and murmuring hall, only ever followed in the end from that.